Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with representatives of a global, multi-stakeholder community.
And I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a dialogue with Melissa Govender. Melissa, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Fritz. Great to be here.
And allow me to introduce you to the audience. You are currently a senior manager of Access Partnership based out of the UK, London, where you head the AI Policy Lab. And if I read that correctly, you also head the Metaverse Policy Lab. Large background in public affairs, regulation, policy, predominantly in South Africa, if I may, if that's correct. And I would like to talk with you about the role you have and also Access Partnership has in this global stage about regulating AI in this case, the topic. So first of all, maybe you can explain Access Partnership, what it does and what your role is.
Sure. So Access Partnership is a public policy consultancy, and we help tech companies and governments regulate the policy environment. And Fritz, as you know, that's everything from data policy, cybersecurity, satellite, telecommunications, spectrum. It's a whole host of topics that we look at. And in terms of what we actually help them do, it can be anything from landscape mapping. So what is happening from a policy perspective? Where are the gaps? How do we address them? To understanding what the licensing and compliance requirements are. To also putting together campaigns where we highlight how specific regulation can be improved, or maybe in some instances hinders tech companies to kind of grow, and we would put recommendations and some thought leadership around that. And so it really is an end-to-end offering that we provide. In terms of the AI Policy Lab, and so when I speak about the AI Policy Lab, I always take a step back to say it started with the Metaverse Policy Lab. And we created that last year where everyone was talking about the metaverse and we weren't really sure what that was, or was this just a concept that Meta had created. And we created a space where people could come together from both the government and a private sector perspective, academics, and actual people who use the technology to just speak about what they felt. And it was in that vein that we then created the AI Policy Lab. So creating a space and a platform for people to start engaging on the issues, understanding what the policy risks are and what the best way to address them is. And we've obviously gone on then to do quite a lot of work within AI, where I'll speak about one piece of work that we did. So we worked with Microsoft and we looked at what is the impact of generative AI on the workforce. And we were commissioned to do these studies in Asia. And based on our findings, we found that only 1%, depending on what jurisdiction was a very small amount of people who were going to be impacted negatively. And it was more about how do governments and companies capacitate people to bring AI into their jobs more, and how do we use it more efficiently. And so we had these roundtables with governments in Asia where we actually sat and we explained some of this, and those are conversations are ongoing. So that's also an example of AI and kind of practically what we're doing around.
Great. Okay, now just to confirm that, another way to you could say describe your organization, you could say a tech policy advisory organization, but that just I could also read this as a lobby organization.
We don't like using the word lobbying because it has some negative connotations. So we like the word advocacy, because I think we're advocating for specific principles and rights. And perhaps something to mention there, Fritz, is that, you know, everything for us is underpinned by fair tech, our fair tech principle. And that is that we believe technology should be beneficial and should be sustainable. And so we would never outwardly advocate for something which we believe will not, you know, will be detrimental to society, for example.
Okay, so how do you, because you mentioned, I just wanted to get that off the table. You mentioned that in some cases, you are an advocate for more policy. In some cases, it's, I would say, harming your client. So we have to take, it's reducing policy. That means that you seem to be in a position where you determine, okay, look, this is enough policy or this is too much policy, irrespective if it's enough or too much. So how do you make certain that you have so a fair assessment of what's good for society and good for general public. So how do you manage the managers?
Yeah, so the middle ground, I guess, is this. So if we look at kind of technology as a whole, what are the principles we want to advocate? I think safety is probably at the forefront. So things looking at screen time, people spending too much time on their devices, also just, you know, security and safety in terms of, is my data secure? What is being collected on me? And so I think there's some principles that are very important to us as, you know, specifically working on it from a public policy perspective. So we understand where government is coming from. And when we speak to our clients, it's also an understanding of, well, here are potentially the negative aspects of tech. What are they? And let's find the middle ground between the two. And in some instances, for example, with AI, I think companies want to be regulated. So it's not that the kind of standard is no to regulation. It's rather a discussion or a conversation around what is the right type of regulation and what ensures that citizens are safe, which is the ultimate point of policy and regulation. And so I think that guides us. And we would never advocate for something that ultimately would be detrimental to society, because that would go against our principles.
Okay. Maybe to follow up on that a little bit, I'm just wondering immediately, you mentioned a couple of organizations you support, and they very much work on a global level. How do discussions then evolve when you take it on an international stage? Because my question behind that is, you might go for a different policy in one part of the world compared to another part of the world. So do you localize policies, but how then do you deal with policies when they have global effects?
I mean, I think that's a great question and quite complex. So I'm South African, so let me bring it back to South Africa, right? So when we talk about the metaverse or even AI to a large degree, these are great pieces of technology that not everyone has access to. So, even just a stable internet connection in most African countries is a challenge. And if we do have it, it's really expensive. So when we go and speak to corporates and governments in the African continent, we want to highlight the connectivity aspect of it. And so it is completely localized. The narrative, the discussion has to be based on what is happening in that society and what is their challenges. And so, for example, with some of our clients, when we're looking at Africa specifically, what is really interesting about the metaverse is the education and healthcare element of it, right? So if we can take rural schools and ensure that they have some sort of connectivity and we give them access to international universities, or they can get to play around with cells because they're using, headsets and the like. Those are the kind of conversations we're having, but also that more Africans can be involved in the tech ecosystem. So how do we teach them how to play with the technology and how to develop more? And so those are some of that digital transformation conversations we're having. Whereas, in the UK, if we're looking at the AI Act, it's a lot more advanced. They're more about like the rights of AI. And so, it's because we have these local experts and we understand the different environments, we're able to kind of have a very specific conversation. But from a global perspective, because one of the things we have been talking about a lot is the idea of a global AI regulator. And for us, how we kind of bring these ideas and competencies together is we already know very well what's happening in all of the regions because we have experts. So we want to understand what the commonalities are, say, between the US's AI Bill of Rights, the UK's white paper on AI, what's happening in Japan, what China is doing. We want to kind of reference all of that and say, okay, what are the commonalities? What are the differences? And if we were to have something global, what would that look like? And another component or flavor that we bring in as well is if you look at it from a multilateral organization, we work a lot with the UN, for example. What does it mean? Or even the ITU, what does it mean from how we've seen things work and not work? And so when we talk about global regulations, what would success look like? And so I think it's all these regional expertise and all this experience working in these different forums that we would bring together and then provide some suggestions.
Okay. Now, if you look at, thank you for that, by the way. If you look at the local differences, are those differences the result of culture or a result of I would say the technical infrastructure an organization or a country or a region has or not doesn't have?
I think it's probably a combination of both. So let me go back to my home market because I'm probably most familiar with it. So, in South Africa, yes, connectivity and infrastructure does impact how we view, how we view tech and how we consume it. But there is also a culture and I think a socioeconomic component to that. So let's look at Uber, for example, right? Uber comes in, it has a platform economy, it threatens existing jobs. And so kind of culturally, how do we deal with that? How do we push back? How does government also look at it? Because it's creating jobs, because it is a platform, but it might also be threatening some established jobs. And so I think it's a combination probably of both. And then also, I mean, the question, if you talk about it from an infrastructure perspective, how many people have access to an app and how many people use it? And in a country like South Africa, it's not the majority, right? Even smartphone usage, it's a small minority at the top who use that. So I guess it would be both. How have you found it in terms of breaking it up between infrastructure and culture?
Well, it's basically this discussion which led me to ask you that question, because I do realize that when I talk about AI, when I talk about the internet, and you live in the Netherlands where I live,
Yeah,
where you have great access to internet and great access to technology. The concern sometimes is that you're unconsciously biased given your own background.
yes,
I'll show you a small story which I'm preparing for a talk in Brunei October this year
yeah,
for the Conference on Innovation Technology. And I was preparing the talk and just when I started in preparation, James Cameron just came out in People's Magazine with a warning. Look, guys, I warned you 40 years ago with the Terminator movie.
yeah,
So be careful of AI. And then it took a little bit of effort before I realized that is the Western mindset, very much on AI, that machines are a threat.
yeah,
If you look at more the Asian countries, if you look at Japan, since the 1960s, they have robot heroes. So, I mean, this is a very black and white statement, but they grow up in a mindset where a robot is a positive thing, and also the AI backing. So to some extent, that's part of culture, maybe popular culture, but it very much realizes it sets our mindset when we discuss these technologies and how we deal with that. So that's my take on it, at least. Knowing there are different answers to the same question is something we have to deal with. And also my follow-up question to you is, outside the technical infrastructure, outside culture, are there other elements in your mind which influence local policies?
outside of culture and infrastructure, I think there's a component of education, and I say that broadly, but let me kind of hone in on it a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting as tech has emerged and as it's developed and its growth, that we also not always familiar with what its benefits are, but also what the concerns are, especially with tech like the metaverse or immersive tech, where we're still trying to figure it out. And so I think there is an education component there for policymakers and for citizens, and also for corporates as well, around, how do we play around with the tech so we actually figure out what the concerns could be? Or how do we, I mean, we've tried to do this a lot with AI, is to kind of look at what we have already from a policy perspective, understand where the gaps are, and then create new policies and legislation. But also like a little bit of self-analysis in the sense of, or critique, what have we got right from a tech perspective? What have we got wrong? And so I think that maybe education is the wrong word. Maybe it's more critical analysis. Maybe that is an important component to how we actually view policies and how we can improve them going forward as well.
Okay. Twofold question there. I mean, thank you for that. First of all, do you think that current society policymakers have enough understanding of, I would say, the AI business case, A, and if they don't, who should educate them?
This is a question we've been grappling with, and there are two kind of sides of the coin, and I'll tell you both, and I'm happy to hear where you put on this. My mind is a little undecided. So I was at a Digital Tories discussion where they were talking about AI regulation specifically, and one of the gentlemen got up and said that we don't have to understand all the components of a car to understand how a car works and what dangers it can provide. And so as government, as long as we have a high level understanding of it, then that is good enough, and we should be in a space to regulate, because we're not meant to be the experts. We're just meant to be there to protect society, which is a fair point. On the other side of the coin is, I think, to understand some of the technical aspects are important. If we get into like open source versus closed source large language models, and there's some issues there around monopolistic behavior, some issues there around inclusivity, about how we use things for the greater good. You would want policymakers to have a little bit of technical knowledge around it. And so we were looking at now, I think the industry is, there's several initiatives out there where they're partnering up with institutions, and they're actually asking governments to basically capacitate themselves, and they're putting curriculums together. So I think that the desire is there. So I don't know which side of the coin you put on, and I'd be happy to hear.
Well, one of the observations I have, and a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to question a very influential politician on a global stage. And I asked him what his take was on the development of digital technology as a whole. And his reply was just like when we invented a car. The very first time the car drove through a village, we put a guy with a red flag in front of it, and 20 years later, we have our first set of rules and regulations to control traffic laws. It was in a room of about 150 people. I'd say well over 100 agreed with the principle. Oh yeah, it's just another innovation. It's just another technology. All the difference between the technology we're now talking about and digital technology as a whole is that we don't have those 10, 20 years to come up with rules and regulations, which is going to protect the general public. So again, that brings me back to the question, is there enough understanding of the impact of the technology? And point taken, you don't have to understand how it works from a technical perspective, but is there enough understanding on its potential impact and the time scale it's working on?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah. Okay. So then second question, who should educate the general public? Who should educate the policymakers to make sure that they understand what's out there?
I think it probably falls between the private sector and academic institutions. I've seen that if you search AI now, you can find quite a lot of universities providing courses on it, which is great. I think the private sector also has a role to play, especially since they're at the forefront of a lot of the tech coming out. And I think making it, so we did this quite a lot at Access Partnership with Spectrum specifically, where we did this capacity building workshops where we simplified what is spectrum, why do you need different spectrum bands, where are the contradictions between different industries wanting different spectrum bands, and what would be best from a policy perspective. And I think from an AI perspective, it really is up to the industry and I would say all stakeholders to, with even NGOs, I think potentially have a role to play in creating a curriculum that is updated. But I also think that the learning needs to be continuous because to your point, I think the technology is always developing. So like refresher courses would be very an important component of that.
Yeah. Okay. Now, assuming that we have a gap at the moment, what's in your mind the biggest threat for accountability to date?
Accountability in terms of
the fact, digital technology can do things we've never envisioned, so we don't have the rules or regulation to have safeguards around that technology. That gap between very fast developing digital technology and rules and regulation, that creates an accountability gap.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you are aware of what you see as the big threats, and are there any in your mind?
I mean, I think from an AI perspective, the industry has said that they want regulation because they are aware of some of those threats. But I'm sure you saw that there was a pledge that they signed in America with the Biden administration, and it was Google and Meta and all the big companies. And they said, you know, we want to do this in a fair way. So we're going to stress test our systems to make sure that they're ethical. We're going to watermark things so you know that this is generated by AI from a content perspective. So the idea of deep fakes and the like can be addressed. And so I think that approach by the Biden administration and the industry is potentially the best way to deal with the accountability deficit, if there is one. It's government coming to say, listen, this is an issue for us, and here are the kind of 7 or 8 things we are thinking important. And then industry coming to say, yes, we pledge to this. But Google, for example, has already put together its own principles on what it thinks should happen from an AI perspective and how responsible AI should be governed. And Microsoft has done a similar sort of initiative. So I think the industry has been proactive, and I think that is potentially the approach that works best.
Okay. No, I do see benefits in self-regulation, and I know that that is a preferred modus operandi, for instance, in the state. If you look at Europe, we very much want government-led legislation and regulation.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that conflict there.
Yeah.
So what works well in one part of the world doesn't work that well, or less accepted in other parts of the world. And so it maybe in the States, the Biden administration accepted the self-regulation proposals by the big tech vendors. What would you do, assuming that that's a very fair and very honest set of rules and regulations? Like, hey, that's the best way. At the same time, people in Europe, people in Asia might be very cynical and say, look, I don't believe this is actually what it should be. It's not good. How do you cope that? How do you then sell, as it were, the self-regulation of the industry?
So I'm not sure we want to sell self-regulation necessarily, but I think what was interesting from what you said is exactly this difference of approach. And we've noticed that when we've been doing our analysis, right? So in the US, it's more kind of market-driven. Let the market operate, and let's work together to kind of ensure the safeguards are there, or the guardrails are there. In Europe, it's more completely right-based, right? So what are the ethical issues around AI? How do we protect our citizens? Very strong interventionists. And then I think in Asia, you know, depending on which country you're looking at, China obviously has taken a very big interest in AI, but also part of the surveillance state and regulating it so that the state always has access to see what is going on to the analysis and the like. And so, and then, you know, other Asians, so we shared an article internally and we were discussing it. I think the EU had gone to Asia to try and replicate its AI EU Act. And many of the Asian states said that they were not ready to have such a heavy-handed approach because they wanted the technology to develop. So I think it is these, you know, you asked the question about culture. I think it's exactly that. I think each jurisdiction has its own cultural affinity, and I don't think we can criticize any of them being for right or wrong. Which is why I think global regulations will be challenging, but it will be interesting to see which approach at the end kind of, you know, wins, so to say.
So basically that means we don't really have like say a short-term solution for global regulation.
I think there are those proponents of the UN and who like the multilateral forums who would say, or even the ITU. I mean, it would be interesting to hear your perspective of this as someone who's worked very closely with the ITU, that there is a role for them to play. How binding are those regulations, and how many of countries would actually enforce them, I think is another question, right?
Yeah. Well, I do hope that the rules and regulation and guidelines at least make people aware that we need to think about them. So I think half of the solution is already there if people start to realize and think about, hey, this has consequences. Being an engineer myself, I can full-heartedly tell you that when I started my education 40 years ago, as an engineer, we were never ever taught anything on ethics, accountability, communication. It was just not part of our charter. That's not what we were there for. The fact that we now include this in education, I
Yeah.
think that's good. And so come back to, I think, the third dimension, which you mentioned about the educational side, how much people are aware of what this technology can do, cannot do, is I think there's a big role to play for a UN to at least educate people
Yes.
and show them the way how it could be resolved, but accepting at the same time that countries, region are going to differ in their final solution they're going to adopt. My concern would be if we would write something which or produce something which is going to be mandatory. I think
Yeah.
it's going to be a nightmare discussion, and then and it's going to take so much time
Yeah.
we don't have,
Yeah.
and then the technology will go overboard. So I would rather see that we demonstrate what's out there, but as soon as we see, hey, this is what we have in common, fix that and set that and turn that into rules and regulations. So focus on what you have in common, but accept the differences.
Do you think like a principles-based approach would be better than actual regulation?
That actually also would even yeah, I think a principle-based approach works better in this case than a rule-based approach.
Yeah.
Because then you have to also think about all the exceptions and all the what ifs.
Yeah.
Principle in that works, but then if you adopt a principle-based approach, also I think you should then think about, okay, what are the safeguards we're going to put in place if somebody goes over those principles, and what are that? But I think short-term starts with education and awareness, where we do agree on a global level, where we need to do something about that. Yes, let's please put that in place, but don't try to fix everything at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an iterative process. That's my assumption and assessment, having been in this place for the last 6-7 years.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable approach, and I think that's most likely the one that will be followed.
Yeah. So yeah, and obviously there are going to be people who disagree with me, but this at least it's a mindset we need. I think that's also the charter of the Institute for Accountability, is we see ourselves as a catalyst to create a global discussion and point people to, okay, these are potential solutions for dealing with that accountability gap we see today.
Yeah.
And that's our role. Our role is not going to be then to deliver those policy measures. There are other entities who are going to be organized to do that. Okay, last couple of questions, Melissa, if I may. In your view, what is the low-hanging fruit? What can we do today? What can we do tomorrow?
From an AI perspective, I think you've just outlined the perfect scenario, Fritz, which is we have global guidelines that each country takes and decides how it's going to implement. I think you also alluded to it, and we spoke about education. I think that's really important for policymakers specifically, but also I think for citizens as well. I think, the onus is maybe on the citizen to understand the technology. I know we were having a debate internally about, trading apps and how everything has changed so significantly now that you have an app on your phone and you can buy shares. And there's a whole lot of risk associated with that, where the consumer doesn't know. He takes all his savings, he puts it in the stock tanks, and now he's lost all of that. And yes, I mean, I think we've seen government put regulations in place so that the risk is identifiable and people understand when they're putting their money in that there'll be issues. But also, I think we need to understand what the risks are. And it's the same with AI as well. Like, a lot of people didn't know that they were putting sensitive information into ChatGPT and it was capturing that, right? And so I also think, how do we educate ourselves as users is important. So I think those are the two kind of lowest hanging fruits for us.
Okay, great. Hey, one question. How do you see the role of an NGO or civil society play here?
I think the role, and it's the one that I think you're playing already, is exactly this. It's having the conversations, it's listening to the concerns, and for me, it's being the conduit between the layman on the street who might not understand all the risks, but kind of taking that, collating those views, and then going to industry and going to government and even academia and saying, listen, this is how society views the challenges, and being part of that conversation and providing the solutions as well.
Great. Okay. Hey, thank you for this great discussion, Melissa. So, no doubt we're going to be in contact, given that we're both on a global scale bringing stakeholders together to find a solution. So our paths will cross, and I'm very glad they've crossed today. And thank you for sharing your thoughts so far.
Thank you, Fritz. And yes, definitely looking forward to seeing you again and working together.